Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to the panel discussion on emerging technologies, pioneering science and disruptive innovations to decarbonize the protein food systems. My name is Leanne Murphy. I'll be the session moderator for this group, bringing their perspective. I'm a member of the Strategic Advisory Committee with the Manitoba Protein Strategy, and I'm also the current president of the Protein Highway Initiative, which connects Canada and the US along the Midwest corridor, looking to improve connectivity around plant-based protein. So this session is being pre-recorded. Any questions that come up during the session, please drop them in the chat, and we'll endeavor to get you answers, if not right away, certainly as quickly as we can. The format for today is we'll do a round of introductions of our panelists, and then we'll have just a series of questions and almost engagement going back and forth around this topic. More importantly, looking for those practical solutions, that attendees at this conference will hopefully take away and put into place. So with that, again, thank you all for joining us. And so we'll start with the introductions. Renee, I'll ask you to go first. Introduce yourself and a little bit about why this topic gets you excited.
Hi, yes, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Renee Vasilos with the Nature Conservancy. I am our Director of Agriculture Innovation. And on behalf of the Nature Conservancy, which is a 70-year plus, one of the largest environmental organizations in the world, we are working on land conservation, but also on what we call land management. So working on how we can provide for people and nature together. And that's where my body of work sits. So I'm part of our global food and water team. And then specifically, I am supporting our venture investments in early stage technologies we believe will get us closer to our soil health building goals. And so why I am incredibly excited to be on this panel is because whenever you're talking about agriculture and decarbonization, soil is I would probably argue the most important player. And so that's where our work is centering. We look to invest in companies that will scale one or a multitude of the practices our scientific research have proven build soil health. So excited to dig in and have these conversations and join with the rest of this exciting panel today.
Great, thanks, Renee. Karen, over to you.
Oh, well, good morning and thank you very much. My name is Karen Hogan-Kazera. I'm the president of Fresco Solutions. Fresco Solutions operates across Canada and globally. Just going to launch the slide here. Who we are, we help our clients, and they come from a variety of organizations. Some of them are not-for-profit, some of them are for-profit, some of them are very large global corporates, some of them are small, and some of them are commodity associations. But we have our tagline, end-to-end sustainability. So we'll meet you anywhere you are on your journey in sustainability and decarbonization. You operate a little unique niche of agriculture and nature-based solutions. And we have a trademarked process called end-to-end carbon road mapping that we work on with our clients to identify their decarbonization strategies. So one of the things we did work on in the end-to-end solution was with Nature United in Canada to identify the natural climate solution pathways for Canada. We worked with Farmers for Climate Solutions to identify further types of decarbonization pathways, and those recommendations and policies went to the federal government, and we have the On-Farm Climate Action Fund as a result of that work. So very happy to support anybody in their journey. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Karen. Okay, over to you, Antonio.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm Antonio Petro. I'm co-director of Regeneration Canada. Regeneration Canada is a pan-Canadian nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting soil regeneration and regenerative agriculture in order to mitigate climate change, restore biodiversity, improve our water cycle, and support a healthy and fair food system. We strive toward these goals by creating spaces for farmer, landowners, scientists, agronomists, businesses, community organization, and government, and above all, citizens to learn, connect, and take action to regenerate our soils. So coming today, talking about decarbonization as a part of a bigger holistic approach to regenerate our ecosystem. And as Renee said, soil is arguably the most important part of all of this. So we look at regenerative ecosystem in general as the most promising, one of the most promising solution to the climate crisis that we are living at these days.
Super, thank you. And Zapper, over to you to introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, for sure. So I am Zapper Dalalbashi. I am with McKinsey & Company. My focus is the alternative protein space in general, and I also expand into the rest of the food industry beyond that. I have worked in Western Canada, so definitely very familiar with this space, and I've done alternative proteins for many years now because of that. And what attracts me to it is obviously the impact it has as a lever in terms of carbon reduction, and how it would help meet the needs of the population, the global population, into the future in a sustainable way that is really needed right now to mitigate the climate change challenges.
Super. Well, thanks you all. And as I said, so our format today is really that I've got a couple of questions to toss out, but really looking for the engagement with you. And as always, with every good panel, as I was listening to the intros, I was struck by the fact that soil health is really a baseline, metric for a couple of folks. Yet we're looking at an integrated system that goes from the field all the way through manufacturing and ultimately to the consumer. So maybe, Renee, I'll ask you, soil health, we think of that as an on the land impact, but how do you see that impacting across the chain, from, that ultimately impacts what consumers purchase?
Well, maybe I would say soil health is the area of focus, but the impacts are on water systems. So that, of course, is a direct consumer impact. Biodiversity has also a critical planetary impact, and the role that soil health plays in building and fostering biodiversity. And there's a growing body of research around healthy soils producing more nutritious food. So in terms of what's grown for actual direct consumption, we're starting to build a body of evidence that healthy soil can build more, will produce healthier food. So that is a direct connection for consumers. Yeah, that would be probably my quick short answer.
Well, it's good because, again, I think part of what we're trying to uncover here is, this is a very broad topic, right? And so one can get very deep on a certain piece, or it can get very broad. So I just wanted to pick that up. Karen, did you want to add something on that?
Sure. I think it's important, as Zafir had said, about taking a look at the entire system. So we not only look and help our clients understand the carbon accounting around soils and the things that soil health bring, but I think we need to also look at, when you think about the major gases and impacts of agriculture, what are those disruptive technologies? What are those innovations that are going to come at us in the ruminant sector, for example? Because, well, the larger the emissions from a particular subsector of agriculture, the greater the opportunity, right? That's the focus on innovation. And so I think, focusing on the ruminant sector, what are the opportunities that can be achieved through disruptive technologies and innovative pathways, as well as nitrous oxide emissions from soils, another big one, right? We have an emission reduction initiative in this country that by 2030, we will reduce 30% of our N2O emissions from soils, and we don't know how to get there. So that has to be another area of innovation that needs to be focused on, and how we are going to meet those challenges in the future.
Great. Okay, so what I'll do then is I'll shift to just some sort of thought-provoking questions that we'd like to call them, and then just sort of do it around the table, or again, in this case, around the screen review of it. clearly we are still in the midst of a pandemic response. Hopefully the end is in sight for all of us, I think we've said, but it's really exposed some of the strengths and weaknesses. And again, we'll focus on the Canadian agri-food supply chain, but really it's been the global supply chain. One of the things that Canada has done, of course, is we have aligned with international commitments around reductions of emissions, so the Paris Agreement, reduced by 30% by 2030, and then the recent COP26, adding to that up to 45% by 2030. So if we take that sort of farm to fork lens and really with a focus on, what are the tools? So what is needed to be developed, if not already there? What needs to be adopted out of new technologies and some of the cool science? Really, what are some of those approaches or even policies that will have some positive near-term impact for us? And maybe I'll throw that one to you, Zapper, to start with.
Yeah, so I think that you're getting to to summarize the question, what are the technologies that can be adopted to allow for a big impact from an alternative protein standpoint into the agricultural system? And so I think that if we reflect on this, we see that there are 2 or 3 waves that one can think of in the alternative protein space. The first one is the plant-based proteins, and which we already see quite a bit of presence on the market from it. And that one, I think there's quite a bit of need for an investment in scaling up the production systems and getting the products to a cost position that is quite competitive with the animal-based proteins, and getting the quality of that product so the everyday consumer can easily interchange between that and animal-based proteins. So the investment in the infrastructure there is critical. The second one is we are seeing some movement on the fermentation-based proteins and insect-based proteins, but those also, there are some significant unlocks that need to happen to make them economically feasible. And we're seeing some examples of, for example, insect-based production being co-located with agricultural processing. So next to a vegetable processing plant, or where you can take a co-product and use the insect farming to grow it. And those investments also need to happen for that sector to grow and become economical. And then the last piece is on the cultured meat front, where the technological challenges are still very substantial, whether that is on the media, the design of the reactor, the cell lines, the regulatory, the acceptance of the consumer. So and all of these need to happen for this to be adopted at scale. So if you were to think at this on 3 levels, you can say plant protein need to be invested in to improve the value chain and improve the overall quality. Insect needs to be unlocked through joint effort between that and the plant industry. And cultured meat has a major scientific uphill to climb before it gets at scale.
Okay. Antonius, do you want to pick up on that theme? Beyond investment, what are some of the, those key enablers that we would like to see?
Yeah, of course. And from Regeneration Canada's point of view, I think beyond the technology and policies, I think what we'd like to bring it to is really to the basic, which is for us connecting everybody to the farmers and ranch and agricultural sector in general. So make more information more available, more accessible to the general public about what's actually happening on the farm, to enable them and to empower them to take their own decision when voting, when buying, and when pushing for different policies. So that's first step. And I guess a second level would be, we all know that at some point we will reach this technology that we're all hoping to get right now. But what we should not forget is that when this time comes, how to make sure that these technology are inclusive, how they are inclusive in terms of cropping system, but also in terms of farm size, in terms of different community and equity deserving communities in this country and globally, because that's a huge issue. And we can do a parallel with the vaccine and all the other technologies that we're seeing, and the difference between the different demographic and socioeconomic realities of different farming community. So that's what I wanted to add it here. Yeah.
Good. Good. Renee, one for you. Again, you take more of a, sort of, pan-North American global look at this. What are your thoughts around some of the both development and adoption of these new technologies in science?
Yeah, so the focus of our work is on solutions that will help on farm. So to feed the inputs that are going into the alternate protein space. And the way our investment thesis is, to borrow from Bill Gates, is to eliminate the green premium. So how can we ensure that producers at scale can actually practice in a way that they're able to sequester carbon in their operations? And so that's what we're looking to support. And so maybe one example is we invested in a financial technology company that is using warranties as a way to de-risk the adoption of cover crops. So their broader agenda is to use warranties to de-risk the adoption of all sorts of technologies, but we partnered with them to develop a warranty specifically around de-risking the adoption of cover crops. So that's one example. Another example that we talk about is around what we recognize as absolutely critical is really focusing on input optimization. And one of the solutions that we've invested in is Swarm Farm, which is an autonomous tractor company. We challenge producers, and everyone talks about precision agriculture, but the reality on the ground is there's been variable rate spraying equipment on the market for over a decade, and the usage rate is incredibly low, which says it's not the right solution. It's not a cost-effective solution for large-scale producers to use. And so Swarm Farm is building a autonomous swarm system to actually cost-effectively allow producers at scale to implement a precision application system, which is absolutely critical. So that's how we're looking at is what are investable innovations and solutions that can help eliminate the green premium for producers at scale to produce in a manner that's helping to sequester more carbon.
Great, thanks, Renee. And how about Karen, over to you, really touching on maybe some examples of technologies or some of the science that it will enable a technology to help us reach these goals.
Yeah, and I'm sorry that I have to do this, but I speak better when I'm when I have some slides just to talk around. So on the topic of soil organic carbon, we spend a lot of time on this stuff. Well, not only because there's such interest in it from the voluntary carbon side of things, where some of the methodologies that you account for and measure change on farm are measurement only, very expensive. The whole arena is expensive right now in being able to detect soil organic carbon change. But many of these standards have a hybrid model measuring, model only, or practice-based, or measure only. Australia has a goal to get their measurement-based methodology from $35 a hectare down to $3 a hectare. It is a part of their technology strategy as a nation, and soil is one of the 4 pillars. So as we head into this arena of so much activity around being able to crack the nut, measure, get away from drilling a core, pulling the core, measuring the bulk density in the lab, measuring depth, percent carbon through an elemental analyzer, very laborious. So we're seeing this plethora of explosion of technologies that are really a combination of machine learning, remote sensing, perhaps a geochemical process-based model built into the mix, training databases, right, through analyzing and calibrating lab measurements with spectral analysis through near infrared, or sometimes in some of the more advanced ones on the old college smart farm is in neutron inactivation. Pulling this device across the field and being able to use inelastic neutron scattering to get an estimate of soil organic carbon. None of this is ready for prime time yet. It's still 3 to 5 years away from commercialization, but to be able to do this stuff at scale, to be able to do it cost effectively, I'm glad to hear, Renee, that you're investing, which is really important. because we are probably the next 5 years going to see some major disruptive breakthroughs here. And there's a lot of investment happening in this space. So that's where I see it in terms of soil organic carbon and soil health.
Right. And maybe I'll just add on to that one question, and you know, you can pop up your hand if you think. A lot of these are, it sounds like, you know, there's a lot of work in development, right, or under spec or in the investment. By my calendar, we've got a very narrow window to not just develop, but to adopt. Do you think that's realistic, that these, you know, and again, I'm not saying, you know, don't get political on the COP26 goals, but the, you know, the timeline from, you know, proofing in the field to actual adoption on a scale that's going to move the needle. Any thoughts on whether we can meet that? Yeah, Renee, please.
Sorry, I lost my mute. What I've actually been really encouraged by, I just recently kind of did a deep dive in this, is the current announcements around several major companies doing inset programs. So this is not carbon offset, but avoided emissions, basically. And the idea, I don't think, there may be some that have, there isn't much evidence of these being sold on the voluntary carbon market yet, but this to me is an encouraging movement towards getting the system ready, should we, when Karen suggests that we will have a real shift towards solutions that can actually be measuring and verifying actual carbon sequestered. And in the interim, this focus on avoided emissions and selling credits through the voluntary carbon markets to the CPGs who have made all of these pretty audacious net zero commitments is very exciting to me. So I see it as a step, right? These are not the same as carbon offsets, certainly, but I believe it's really critical, and the action that has to be taken is very similar, right? So if you are trying to take advantage of these inset markets, you will also be making changes on farm around that are really important for building up soil health. And so I'm very excited about those recent announcements. Cargill's announced, Corteva, Bayer, Nutrien, they've all announced programs. So that's something I feel excited and encouraged by.
Zapper, I have a question for you around this idea of timeline. And what are your thoughts around, as these 2030 dates approach, will that drive behavior in your prediction, or are we on a path that it's organic and will follow step to step, and 2030 will just be the a date?
I think that what we are seeing is that target actually became very aspirational to players in the industry. And so if you look at those three parallels, which I described early on, I think plant-based proteins are very much on track to be a substantial play by the 2030 from a protein standpoint. If you look at the one that is a bit more of a challenge, at the cultured meat side of it, I think there is a potential there, but also the risk of it is higher just because of the complexity of the production system. And so I think that having the data in place had been very helpful, I think, because it really got everybody on board in terms of, here's the timelines that we're trying to work against, and everybody aspired to work with those. And it just sets a bar that we all try to meet, basically. And some of it is likely to work, and some of it might face delays, just the nature of working with new technology. And we are assessing, actually, we have some internal thinking here on what is a good technology analogy to take in either case. So for example, on the plant-based protein, you can see that products are on the market established, it's moving forward, it's doing relatively well. On the cultured meat, there's some major unlocks that need to happen, like we did in DNA sequencing, for example, for it to hit the 2030 targets.
Great, excellent. Okay, I'm going to shift to another question here then. So consumers, we all know consumers drive most of either the conscious or unconscious decision making, and are increasingly looking for sustainably produced products. But at the same time, as Karen showed on her slide, there is a wide and I think ever-growing array of agri-food stakeholders. We're really trying to either define sustainability or find a place, to put sort of a flag in the field, as it were. Some of the metrics, debate, they include characteristics, which can vary. Greenhouse gas emissions obviously are one of the leading indicators. What are some of your thoughts on some of the emerging technologies and, and pioneering science that really are going to come in, to do this? So we talked about some of the, the schemes, and some of the investments that are needed. But is there really, when we look at greenhouse gas, as a specific, what is one around that you'd like to sort of see either broader adoption or would have a fit in a plant system or a protein system that includes both plants and animals? And how, Antonius, I'll toss that one on to you first.
Yeah, of course. I think where we should start is by really working together to identify a context and a place-based framework of these practices where biophysical, social, and economic barriers are taken into account. We talked a lot about regenerative agriculture and principles, but we've been experiencing in our work is that it really needs just to start by understanding the history of the land, history of soil, and to adapt these practices and principles to the actual reality of the farmer and rancher. And maybe that's why we launched this project a year ago at Regeneration Canada, which is Regeneration Canada map of regenerative farms in across the country, where we really try to paint a picture of practices that are tailored to specific context in different regions, provinces, and territories in the country, in Canada, and then link these to consumers. So at one point, from one hand, we are encouraging peer-to-peer knowledge sharing between farmers and ranchers, and from the other hand, we're also giving more and more information to consumers and the general public to do their own research and to take their own decision based in science and observation, but also in human connection with local and regional growers in their area. So it's all really, for me and for us here at Regeneration Canada, it starts by understanding what are the specific practices that can work depending on the soil type, the geoclimatic condition, and other culture and financial realities on the farm.
Okay, maybe Renee, I'll ask you, based again on the sort of the broad experience background you've got, so the desire to have a practice base, which reflects, all those very important both social and economic and cultural goals, and putting them into a measurable third party, tick the box kind of scheme. What are some of the processes that would help us get there?
Well, that's a great question. I saw that Karen, that you had Regrow as one of your clients. So they are a group that is trying to facilitate that, so to actually be able to gather that information and put it together, though their target market is not necessarily the consumer, but the food company or the off-taker, so Cargill or ADM. And so I guess one thing we've started to see is regenerative organic labeling. I think there are real limitations on that, just as we've seen kind of a limitation for organic labeling. It's costly for the producers, and of course, it's also a premium for consumers. Another technology that I've heard of recently, and it's called, there's a group out of MIT in Cambridge, Mass. that's working on this. It's called the Bionutrient Association, but to actually be able to measure the nutrient density of food. So instead of you, mother or consumer, having to guess which carrot is healthier, you'll actually be able to test it live in the supermarket. That would be a potential game changer. the real challenge I have with all of this is that, again, tying back to the audacious Paris goals, is that food actually makes this very small percentage of what we're producing, right? And so the conversation, like, I don't feel that consumers will be the savior in this effort, because the majority of production actually isn't going for direct consumption. And so there's kind of a gap. If that's we're going to have a pretty significant gap if we're relying on consumers. And so while I believe they play an important role, I think we really need to also be thinking about holding the biofuel industry to account, the feed industry to account. So yeah, I guess we're still working on that, I think.
Good. And Zapper, when we go back to this sort of, accountability or measurability, or what I call the third party step back, I can make a statement, but until somebody says, yes, she made the correct statement, it's really not seen as valid. In some of these systems, as Antonius was mentioning, that really want to reflect, what is happening in as many local communities, whether that be, plant-based or animal-based. What would be some of the challenges then of moving that into that measurable metric-driven system?
Yeah, I think that the driver is the health perception. And so I think that it will continue to be adopted, or when we survey the industry, basically, we see that the majority of the consumers actually switch into plant-based or alternative-based proteins because it is perceived as a healthier option. And so I think that is really a key driver. And the question becomes whether it's more valuable to continue to have it perceived as such and in fact be as such, or it's more helpful to actually try to put a system in place, similar, just for an example's sake, to the organic system, where people have like a validation on the product that gives them the answer to that this is organic, and then they can decide on it. I think that overall, at least the initial thinking is because you want this to be introduced to the general public, not to a subsegment of the public like the vegan or the vegetarian, because to hit the targets that you're interested in, the average consumer has to buy it. And so I think because of that, you need to spread awareness, and you need to make sure that the average consumer has access to it. It's affordable, they can buy it, they can use it as a reliable source for like texture and flavor purposes. And that I think will be much more effective in adoption than trying to just rely on a label or a metric that only selective consumers would be interested in.
Good point. And Karen, I mean, so your world is the world of the metrics, right? And trying to keep track of whether it's the various schemes or the drivers, that have led to why I need a new scheme because the current one isn't meeting, A, B, or C. What would you like to contribute around that? Because the plethora of schemes, I think, is the biggest challenge, and it may be the biggest opportunity if we get it right. And I land on both sides of that.
No, and actually what Renee had said, it tweaked me because I hadn't thought about it in that context before. So happening right in Manitoba at this point in time is a Scope 3 pilot, where those Scope 3 emissions, the supply chain emissions, not an offset, it's an inset. We've been operating for 2021, scaling up to 2022. Never before has there been two companies coming together to deploy on the ground. So I spent the better part of my career trying to develop protocols in Alberta's offset system that makes sense for growers on the ground. Started in 2007, we must have iterated how many times trying to get this right, trying to make sure it works with the equipment, the data level capabilities of gathering things on the ground. So we're deploying blueprints, they call them, in the supply chain carbon. The conservation cropping protocol, which is a no-till direct seeding, and the nitrous oxide emission reduction protocol, which is based on the 4R nitrogen nutrient stewardship. That's customized to the conditions, the expectations, the goals of each grower, their soils, their eco district, which is their climate, et cetera, to be able to customize implementing practices that reduce nitrous oxide emissions. Enhanced efficiency fertilizers are part of that. So nitrification inhibitors, slow release fertilizers, which are new technologies, but are not like commercially, it's expensive. It's expensive, right? It's $30 an acre sometimes when you put these high efficiency fertilizers on. So we need market pull, whether that's an offset or an inset. The new microbials on the market, Sound and Pivot Bio in the US have a free living nitrogen fixing bacteria that associates itself with corn roots. And it actually fixes the nitrogen from the atmosphere as the plant goes forward. These are breakthrough technologies, but it's really important that we have to have things that make sense for growers on the ground. But this pilot is also, Nutrients working on deploying the 4R management. They're both co-investing for, dollars for verified outcomes, third-party verified outcomes that we're tracking through the whole metric system according to those protocols. And so the farmers are getting premiums and incentives based on that at today's current carbon prices. But the expectation, and I want to emphasize this today, is carbon intensity metrics. So Nutrien is wanting to get a reduced carbon intensity use of fertilizers sold with the improved emission factors, the reductions of emission factors and removals. Maple Leaf wants the lower carbon intensity grain to feed to their pork and poultry operations. And so following that carbon intensity through the entire supply chain, it's designed now that Maple Leaf may sell to McDonald's. The canola may go to Cargill for crush, and McDonald's has lower carbon intensity against their goals. It's super important to pay attention to the carbon intensity, that reduction that goes along with the good. And it's also going to be really important for the clean fuel standard in Canada, because low carbon feedstocks of canola and of wheat are going to be sought after by companies that need to meet the compliance obligations in the clean fuel standard. So carbon intensity is really important.
Excellent, excellent. So and we had talked about, we use the consumer, and to me, the consumer is usually the next person in the chain. So the ultimate end consumer, really to me is an important link, obviously, but in a B2B or business to business world, that next consumer of your product, we can take that look at it. And when we talk about that sort of the next link in the chain, certainly in Manitoba and elsewhere in the globe, we're not, alone in this, is the trust of the public. And whether that is, again, the B2B public or the ultimate consuming public, the politicians, trust that we know what we're doing as we're either implementing or thinking about this is really at the core. Some of the challenges we've got is that, some of the technology that Zapper mentioned, whether it's cultured products or insect-derived, protein, some of these are kind of, a little bit out there for the average consumer. Some of them are philosophically driven, GMO versus organic. There is a lot of technology that we may not be permitted to use to help us advance some of these decarbonized goals. What are some of the ways that at least from the agriculture industry writ large, we could start to address some of that? And Renee, I'll go to you first, if you don't mind on
that. The trust issue on how things are actually produced.
Or which technology is acceptable to meet a goal. It could be exciting, but unacceptable.
Right. That's playing out like live action right now with the focus on gene editing, right? The EU has mandated gene editing as being the equivalent of genetic modification, and so there's challenges there. Whereas in the US, it's being really embraced. So this is application in many applications, but mainly in the seed space for our kind of on the production ag side of the equation. I think and agriculture isn't the only one grappling with this, but there will be a constant pull between, as you suggested, technologies that need to drive some very significantly different outcomes and perception and taste and well, also a host of other reasons for potential opposition. So I think one of the lessons I've understood from folks that were part of the GMO early days is transparency. Instead of trying to just assume everyone was on board and push things forward, to really start instead with a more transparent messaging around what is the technology and why it's being introduced. Leanne, exactly to your point around, right, like the why being kind of this pretty audacious planetary goals we're all hopefully kind of starting to rally around. And so I think leading with transparency around what the technologies are and why they're being introduced is critical to at least starting for folks to start to get comfortable with what might be coming down the pike.
That's good. Zapper, on that, so I'm looking at sort of at the which link in that very complicated supply chain will ultimately decide if a technology, you know, meets the public trust piece, because I can be transparent and overly science, and other than another scientist, nobody understands me. So which link do you think is going to be the one that ultimately gives the yay or nay on some of these exciting new technologies? You can choose one or just be generic.
Yeah, so I think that from looking at previous industries, one can say that the closer you are to the consumer, the more careful you have to be, basically, because that becomes much more clear for the consumer. And like you identified, it takes especially when we're getting into these sophisticated technologies, it takes a lot of work to make sure that the consumer is actually comfortable with them if they have direct exposure to them. So I think that anything that gets closer and closer down the value chain to the consumer becomes a little bit more critical to make sure that the consumers in general are comfortable with that technology platform.
Perfect. So I don't know, Karen or Antonius, do you have anything you'd like to speak on this topic? We're just coming up towards the end of our panel here. So
yeah, and I guess maybe I'd use the breakthrough technology. We've been working with 3NOP and Royal DSM out of the Netherlands, and it's a product. It's a synthetic product that was produced in silico, sort of following a pharmaceutical trial, and then into in vivo, and then into in vitro, and then in vivo. And you're messing with milk, right? Especially milk. It's a very simple molecule, but it doesn't exist in nature. And so, you know, very careful, the regulatory process between FDA and Health Canada joint, it probably won't be approved for use. The hoops that DSM had to go through with, you know, C14 labeling, metabolic digestion, is there any residue in the milk? You know, is it affecting the beef, etc. So, you know, it is a very challenging thing. When it's close to the consumer is drinking the milk, the consumer is eating the meat. But the breakthrough technologies of measuring at the pen level with lasers, we saw dramatic results at a pen level in terms of feeding that product and seeing over 80% reduction in methane from the feedlot. We can't say it's just enteric methane because it was coming from all sorts of things, but consumer acceptability is going to be a challenge.
No, fair enough. Antonius, I'll give you 1 minute. Yeah, Tim.
Yeah, of course. I would just add also to what Renee was saying about the transparency. I would add the diversity of the choices. We were talking a little bit earlier about the role that big enterprises and corporations play. And I also want to bring our focus a little bit to the small and medium businesses and enterprise, with which we can really create closed loop and smaller ecosystem where we can connect these businesses with, you know, their provider locally and regionally. And we've been seeing this in Canada, where if you need your ingredient from less than 20 farms, it is possible that we connect you to these 20 farms, we actually can direct your consumers to the actual farm where your oat or pumpkin seed are coming from. And here we're, tackling the transparency, but also diversification. So technologies are important, but we also need to respect the consumer choices. And we can see this happening in the medical field as well. So I think that would be important.
Yeah, perfect. Good. So as we come up to the end of this session, and the beauty is we can always, find lots to talk about. And I'm sure this won't be the first time we touch on this topic. I'm going to give you each sort of one sentence to, in the utopian resource non-limited, you are in charge world. What does that farm to fork supply chain look like that would help us get to this decarbonize, or to these audacious goals as we've been calling them? And Karen, I'll start with you if you don't mind.
Okay, well, if I was queen for a day, is what you're saying, I would love to see multiple investment along the supply chain on farm to share in the risk and the reward of moving regenerative ag practices and breakthrough technologies forward in a shared value context. Like Renee said, it's really about shared value for public trust. Why? Simon Sinek, why? Why are we trying to do all this? What is the benefit for society? What's the benefit for the farmer? What's the benefit for the corporation? I'm sure we can find an alignment.
Perfect. Zapper, your one sentence on how the world would be righted if you were in charge?
Yeah, I think that it's in line that there's definitely needed significant investments across the value chain to bring costs down to a point where it is not only on parity with animal protein, but I think it has the potential to be well below on cost, and it becomes part of the global food solution. And in that case, you can see the full potential. Perfect.
Antonius?
Yeah, it would be an ideal world if we can bring modern science and traditional and indigenous knowledge to the farmers, and providing and supporting farmers in their mental health and their economic and social and cultural transition into a regenerative world, and have them on the center of all our decisions.
Great. And Renee?
I would, again, coming from the investor side of the equation, in my ideal world, weighs profits equally with water system impacts, biodiversity outcomes, and carbon outcomes. So really fixing the demand side of the equation, right? Like changing the whole equation to put significant weight on the impact of production. I think if we started with the demand side of the equation being corrected, which really is kind of the driver for all of these activities, I think we would see incredible leaps and bounds in what's happening in the field and with consumers' diets.
Perfect. Well, certainly on behalf of the Summit Committee and all the participants, I want to thank you for sharing your time as well as your perspectives and thoughts on this topic. As I said, it won't be the first or the last time, or it won't be the last time, sorry, that we engage around this. So again, thank you very much, and look forward to continued engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.